Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was a curious telegram that brought the case to our attention, a short, clipped message from Inspector Lestrade that read, "Urgent. A man found dead in a locked room with no corners. Location, Sycamore House, Sussex Downs. No explanation possible. Require Holmes immediately." It was the kind of sentence that stirred Holmes like a match to dry tinder. The more paradoxical the premise, the more vigorously his mind leapt into action. We arrived at Sycamore House just after dawn, having taken the night train and a private carriage through the pale stretches of the Sussex countryside. The manor stood solitary, framed by heather and fog, with a peculiar structure jutting out from its eastern wing, an annex of modern design, geometric yet oddly unsettling, as if a mathematician's nightmare had been rendered in concrete and steel. Lestrade met us on the gravelled path, looking more baffled than usual. "I'll say it plain, Mr. Holmes," he said, removing his hat. "It's not a locked room mystery, it's something else." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Something else? You rarely dabble in abstraction, Lestrade." The inspector led us to the annex. The door was locked from the inside. No windows, no furniture, no corners, Mr. Holmes. The whole chamber is a seamless oval, like the inside of an egg, and yet— He opened the thick iron door. A man lay in the centre of the featureless room. Middle-aged, well-dressed, his face fixed in a look not of fear, but of profound confusion. Not a mark on him, save for a faint indentation near the temple. No weapon, no signs of struggle, just that expression, almost as though he'd realized something terrible a second too late. Holmes stepped inside and turned slowly, eyes sweeping the smooth, concave walls. "No ceiling fixtures," he muttered. "No floorboards to pry, no seams, save for the doorway, and no corners. Indeed." He crouched beside the body. Who was he? "Name's Elijah Vance," Lestrade replied. "Private collector, odd fellow, lived alone. The annex was his own design, built last spring. He called it his thought chamber. No servants allowed inside, locked it from within every evening after supper. Time of death? Roughly 10 o'clock last night, found this morning when the staff couldn't raise him." Holmes ran a finger along the base of the wall. "You searched the room thoroughly?" Lestrade scoffed. "There's nowhere to search." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he lay flat against the floor, eyes open to the ceiling, or rather the continuous curve of wall that simply flowed upward. After a moment he stood and faced me. "Watson," he said, "what does the absence of corners tell us?" "That the room was deliberately designed to eliminate angles," I replied. "But to what end?" Holmes nodded. "That is the first question, not the last. Mr. Vance built a room that defied convention, and now he lies dead inside it. The design is not incidental, it is integral." We stepped back into the hallway, and Holmes gestured for Lestrade to close the door. The latch sealed with a heavy clunk. Holmes turned to the inspector. "Was anything taken from the body?" "Just this," Lestrade said, producing a folded slip of paper. "Was in his jacket pocket, blank on one side, on the other a single sentence." Holmes took it. I read over his shoulder. "The mind folds where walls do not." He stood still for a long moment, then slipped the paper into his coat. "Very well," Holmes said quietly. "Let us begin with the architecture." The inspector frowned. "The builder's already been interviewed. Local fellow, Robert Drexler. He swears the room is sound, no mechanical tricks. We saw the blueprints. Everything checks out." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Then let us assume he told the truth. The room is sound, and yet Mr. Vance is no longer alive to enjoy it." We followed Lestrade back down the hall, but Holmes paused once more at the threshold of the annex, glancing toward the ceiling centre. He muttered to himself. "A man builds a room with no corners, locks himself in each night, and is found dead without violence or escape. Curious indeed. And then he turned to me. "Watson," he said, "we are not investigating a murder. We are deciphering a philosophy." And with that, the case of the room with no corners had truly begun. Chapter 2, First Impressions of a Collector's Mind. The drawing room of Sycamore House bore little resemblance to the unnerving annex we had just left behind. It was warm, well furnished in dark cherry wood, and lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing an extraordinary range of oddities. Skulls from animals I could not name, coins minted under vanished empires, and at least 2 shelves dedicated entirely to books without titles on their spines, each bound in grey, unmarked leather. Holmes wandered slowly among them, not touching anything, only observing. His eyes flicked from shelf to painting, from carpet weave to curtain tassel, noting details I had already missed. I stood at the hearth, looking at the framed photograph above the mantel, a solitary image of Elijah Vance standing outside the annex during its construction. Even then, the chamber behind him looked out of place, a monolith without context. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said quietly, "was Mr. Vance of sound mind?" The inspector hesitated. "We asked the same. The servants say he was eccentric but not unstable, kept a strict schedule, never raised his voice, ate the same meals, walked the same paths, wrote every morning in that little room." He paused, glancing back toward the hall. "But they also said he believed the annex had properties that made thought sharper, in his words." "Sharper," Holmes echoed, the word turning over in his mouth like a coin. "Did he suffer from migraines?" "I don't believe so. Why?" Holmes merely waved it away. "And who inherits the estate?" "A niece, Margaret Vance, teaches music in Exeter. They weren't especially close, but he had no children. She's already en route. Should arrive by evening." Holmes made no reply. He was staring intently at the desk in the far corner of the room. It had been left tidy, too tidy. A single fountain pen lay centered on a blotter with no ink stains. The letter tray was empty. The wastebasket beside it had been lined with fresh paper. But it was the wall above the desk that captured his interest. It was bare, save for a set of fine pinholes, 4 in a square. Something had been there recently and had been removed with care. "Lestrade," Holmes said, "was anything reported missing?" "No, not to my knowledge." "You think something's been taken?" "I think," Holmes said, "that a collector of obscure items does not leave the center of his workspace unadorned without cause. Something hung here, and quite recently. I can still see the impression of its frame." He turned to the butler, an older gentleman named Chalmers, who stood discreetly by the door. "Chalmers, what occupied this space above the desk?" The man hesitated, then answered in a quiet, measured tone. "A drawing, sir. Quite strange. Abstract, almost. Mr. Vance said it was a symbol of recursion. Looked like a spiral, but also a cube. Hurt the eyes if you stared too long." "And when did it disappear?" Chalmers shifted his weight. "I noticed it gone yesterday afternoon. I thought perhaps he had taken it into the annex." Holmes's eyes lit slightly. "Then we must assume someone else removed it. Tell me, had Mr. Vance any regular visitors?" "Only 2, sir. A Dr. Petrin, his physician, and a Mr. Alton Price. They would meet on Sundays to speak about, well, thoughts mostly." "Thoughts?" "Philosophy, sir, and mathematics. Mr. Price was writing a book. He said Mr. Vance was the only man he could debate without anger." Holmes chuckled softly at that. "High praise indeed. And when was Mr. Price last here?" 3 nights ago, they argued, though not loudly. I believe Mr. Price left in some agitation." Lestrade's brow lifted. "That's the first I've heard of it." "I didn't think it important," Chalmers said apologetically. There was no threat, no violence. Mr. Vance was very calm afterward. He said, "He still doesn't see it, but he will." Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You see, Watson, this is no ordinary collector's den. This is a sanctum, a man's attempt to frame his own mind in architecture and image, and if that image has been stolen, along with the only man who could explain it, it suggests motive not of greed or hatred, but of comprehension." He stepped back toward the hall. "Come," he said, "before we speak with this, Mr. Price, I should like to examine the annex one more time, not for what it contains, but for what it refuses to allow." "Refuses to allow?" I echoed. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson, the room with no corners might not be meant to keep things in, but to keep something out." And with that enigmatic remark, we followed him once more into the smooth, seamless chamber where thought itself had met an invisible boundary, and perhaps death. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. The annex greeted us with the same unnatural silence as before, as if its smooth, continuous surface swallowed even the sound of our breath. Holmes stepped inside first, his hand brushing lightly against the curve of the wall, his footfalls unnervingly hollow on the polished cement floor. The chamber had no scent, no draught, no echo. It was, in every sense, a sealed thought. I lingered near the threshold, feeling again the subtle disquiet that the room inspired. There was something unwholesome in its geometry, not wrong in an obvious way, but subtly off, as if every instinctual understanding of space failed here. It was not a place meant for living things. Holmes knelt beside the body of Elijah Vance, still untouched where it lay at the exact center of the oval floor. "You will note," Holmes said, eyes still scanning the room, "that there are no books, no desk, no tools, not even a chair." "No possessions of any kind," I agreed. "It is monastic." "Or clinical," Holmes added. "And yet he came here daily, for hours at a time." He stood and began to pace, moving slowly in a spiraling pattern that mirrored the shape of the room. "There is a curious contradiction here, Watson. Vance built a chamber that eliminates the most basic architectural principle, the corner. And in doing so, he also eliminated orientation. There is no facing wall, no back of the room." I looked around and realized he was right. The eye could not rest on anything. There were no features to cling to, no shadows or edges to guide the gaze. Holmes stopped mid-step and turned his full attention to the floor beneath Vance's body. "Lestrade mentioned no marks," he said, "but I see one, faint, nearly invisible. Look here." I moved beside him. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the right angle of the light, I caught it, a nearly imperceptible smear on the otherwise immaculate surface, a shallow arc, like something had been dragged a few inches. "Blood?" I asked. "Dust, perhaps," Holmes muttered. "Or powdered chalk. Not natural dust, however, manufactured." He drew a small glass vial from his coat and collected a trace of the material with a knife edge. This was applied, not settled, a residue used deliberately, but why only here? Why only beneath the body? He turned toward the ceiling then, and his gaze narrowed. "Watson," he said slowly, "fetch the lamp from the hallway, the one with the adjustable flame." I returned a moment later, handed him the lamp, and watched as he dimmed it to the faintest glow. He held it low and rotated slowly around the chamber, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Then, just as he reached the far curve of the chamber, opposite the door, he stopped. "Ah," he whispered. "There you are." "What is it?" I asked, moving closer. He pointed to a single pinhole in the wall, smaller than the head of a nail and utterly invisible in normal light. But now, with the lamp casting low rays, it revealed a thin reflective gleam, as if something metallic sat just behind it. "An aperture," Holmes said, placed at eye level, not visible from the center, but aligned with the wall's curvature so precisely that it blends into nothingness. I stared at the pinhole. Someone could have watched him. Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely, more plausible. It's part of a mechanism, a valve, perhaps, or a vent. But if it is a vent, then it is a most peculiar one, for it leads into solid stone, unless, of course, it does not." A faint grin touched his lips. "This room, Watson, was designed to be perfectly empty. But no man builds emptiness without intent. There is always a purpose to silence this absolute." Before I could reply, a voice echoed faintly from the hall. Lestrade. "Holmes, the niece has arrived, Miss Margaret Vance." Holmes gave the pinhole one last glance. "Then let us hear what the heir to the room with no corners has to say," he said, stepping toward the door. And as we left the chamber, I felt once more that sensation, not of being watched, but of being excluded. As if the room had not welcomed Vance in, but had kept the rest of the world out. Chapter 4. The Niece and the Vanishing Spiral. Margaret Vance stood in the library with the posture of someone accustomed to not being believed. She was a woman in her late 20s, plainly dressed, with the kind of tired composure that suggests life had long ago taught her the futility of raised voices. She greeted us with a nod, but her eyes went immediately to the sealed door of the annex down the corridor. "I thought I would feel something," she said quietly, "when I saw it. But I don't. Just cold." Holmes inclined his head. "You hadn't visited your uncle in some time, I understand." "Not since the annex was finished. We corresponded, if you can call it that. He sent notes, short, strange things, one line at a time, like riddles." "Riddles?" She reached into her coat pocket and handed Holmes a small bundle of yellowed slips, each barely larger than a calling card. He read aloud as he sifted through them. "A curve becomes a corner if believed hard enough. Silence is what remains when thought finishes. The spiral is not a shape, it is a surrender." Holmes glanced at me, then at her. "Were you concerned for his mental state?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes, but I also knew he believed in what he was building. He said the annex would change how the brain folds around meaning. He didn't want help. He wanted to arrive, whatever that meant." "Did he speak of a visitor named Alton Price?" She nodded. "Endlessly. He said Price was the only person who could challenge him without breaking the mirror." "Curious phrasing," Holmes murmured. Margaret sat down in the armchair beside the unlit hearth. "We had this drawing. It was strange, even by his standards. I remember it vividly. A spiral that looked like a cube if you stared long enough. He kept it above his desk. I saw it years ago, the last time I came." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you remember its name?" "Yes," she said softly. "He called it the room inside the room." He stood, pacing slowly. "Do you know where it is now?" She looked up, startled. "It's missing?" He nodded. "Removed with care, not stolen in haste. The impression remains on the wall, but not a trace of the drawing itself, not in the annex, not in the house." She frowned, processing this. "Then it wasn't just an accident?" Holmes didn't respond directly. Instead, he opened the slip of paper Lestrade had found on the body and handed it to her. She read aloud, "The mind folds where walls do not." She blinked, as if some private memory had stirred. "That's what he said the last time we spoke, not in a letter, in person, just that one sentence," and then he turned and walked away. Holmes lowered himself into the chair opposite her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice gentler now, "tell me the truth. Did you fear for your uncle's life?" She looked away for a long moment before answering. "No, not his life. But I feared that he'd built something he didn't understand, that the room would change him." Her eyes met mine, wide and exhausted. "I think it did." We said nothing for a moment. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy that clung to the stone walls of Sycamore House. Then Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, Lestrade, bring the blueprints." "The blueprints?" Lestrade asked, confused. "Yes, the original architectural plans for the annex. There's something I must confirm before we visit Mr. Alton Price." "And what would that be?" I asked. Holmes turned toward the hallway, eyes burning with quiet urgency. "I must know whether the room was built to deceive the man inside it or to deceive the world outside." He paused, one hand on the doorknob. "And Watson, begin noting the phrases we've heard so far. They're not riddles, they're a language, and someone else has learned to speak it." Chapter 5. Mr. Price has a theory. We found Alton Price in a borrowed room above a bookshop in Eastbourne, a man whose mind seemed to lean perpetually forward, as if gravity pulled harder on his thoughts than on the rest of him. He was tall, narrow, and possessed the intense demeanour of a philosopher too long unchallenged. His spectacles clung to the tip of his nose, and his fingers were stained with ink, as if the pages had begun to reject him. Holmes did not introduce himself immediately. He simply stepped into the room and looked around. The walls were lined with mathematical diagrams, spirals, Mobius loops, and sketches of impossible shapes, geometries that defied standard comprehension. At the center of it all sat Price, hunched over a draft manuscript titled Unfolding the Closed Mind. Holmes finally spoke. "Tell me, Mr. Price, when did you first begin to suspect the spiral wasn't a metaphor?" Price looked up slowly, his eyes wary but alert. "I take it you're not here for books?" "I'm here because Elijah Vance is dead," Holmes said simply, "and because the drawing you called a cognitive trap is missing." Price leaned back in his chair, the air in the room growing suddenly heavier. "I didn't kill him," he said. "But I warned him that room was a mistake." Holmes tilted his head. "Because it distorted thought?" "No," Price said, "but because it completed one." I felt a chill settle over the room. Price gestured vaguely toward his chaotic diagrams. Vance believed that space could be reconfigured to accelerate cognition, not in a metaphorical sense, mind you, but literally. He thought sharp corners interrupted the flow of abstract reasoning. The annex was his final experiment. He called it a non-Euclidean observatory. "And the drawing?" Holmes asked. "It was a key, not to a lock, but to a pattern. When viewed inside the annex, on that wall at that angle, it supposedly triggered a recursive loop in the brain, self-reference stacked upon self-reference, a spiral of comprehension folding inward." "And what would that cause?" I asked, finally unable to hold my silence. Price looked at me with a faint, almost sympathetic smile. "Collapse, not of the mind but of boundaries, between memory and imagination, between internal and external. He believed that if he could sustain that loop, the self would vanish, leaving only understanding." "A dangerous game," Holmes muttered. "I told him as much," Price said, his voice sharper now. "But he dismissed me, said I was still clinging to corners." Holmes paced the room slowly, eyes on the scattered sketches. "You visited him 3 nights ago," he said. "There was an argument?" Price sighed. He showed me the final version of the drawing, said it was complete, that he would test it the next night. "I told him not to. I told him the mind has safeguards for a reason. That recursion without exit is not brilliance, it's madness." "And you left?" Holmes said, voice flat. "Yes." Holmes stopped, turned. "You did not return?" "No. Not even when the lights went out at Sycamore House at precisely 10:15, the following night?" Price hesitated. Just a flicker. But Holmes saw it. "You were watching," Holmes said softly. "You couldn't stay away." Price's voice was barely audible. "I was afraid of what he'd become, of what he might unlock." Holmes leaned on the edge of the desk. "Then let me ask you plainly, did you remove the drawing?" Price met his gaze, unwavering. "No, I wouldn't dare, not after what I saw." "What did you see, Mr. Price?" Price swallowed. "At 10:15, every light in the annex went out, but something glowed faintly from inside, for just a moment, like a spiral made of heat. And then it vanished." The room fell silent. Holmes straightened. "Thank you, Mr. Price. That will be all for now." We made our way down the narrow stairs in silence. At the door, Holmes finally spoke. "Watson, we must return to the annex at once." "What changed?" "Nothing," Holmes said grimly. "But if Price told the truth, we are no longer investigating murder in the conventional sense. We are investigating what happens when a man attempts to build a room for thought and dies because thought accepted the invitation." Chapter 6. A blueprint with no edges. By the time we returned to Sycamore House, dusk had turned the annex into a darker silhouette against the garden wall, a shadow without angles, squatting silently like a sealed riddle. Inside, Lestrade was waiting with a large rolled canvas in his hands and a troubled look on his face. "I've reviewed them twice," he said, unrolling the architectural plans across the library table. "They make less sense each time." Holmes crouched beside the parchment, smoothing it carefully. The blueprint was a precise rendering of the annex in top-down and sectional views, drawn in fine ink and annotated in Vance's own hand. At first glance, it confirmed what we already knew. An oval chamber, seamless walls, no entry, but the singular iron door. No windows, no corners. Holmes traced the curvature with his finger, pausing at the notations along the inner perimeter. "These dimensions," he murmured, "they're inconsistent." "Inconsistent how?" I asked, leaning in. "Look here," he said, pointing to a number along the wall's arc. "It lists the internal length of the chamber as 21 feet precisely. But 3 lines down, this notation references a spatial compression ratio." "A what?" Lestrade frowned. Holmes tapped the phrase, "subjective perception radius, to exceed physical parameters by controlled curve tension." "In other words," Holmes translated, "the room was designed to feel larger from the center than it measures from the outside." "But that's not possible," I said, blinking. "Not without mirrors or trickery." "Indeed," Holmes said, "unless the trick is not visual but cognitive. If the walls subtly curve in a way that bends spatial perception, the mind might register infinite loop rather than finite chamber." Lestrade stepped back from the plans. "That's not architecture, that's sorcery." Holmes smiled thinly. "Or obsession taken to its furthest mathematical conclusion." He moved to the wall behind the desk, gesturing for Chalmers, the butler, who stood nearby with silent unease. "You said the drawing was taken yesterday?" "Yes, sir. Sometime in the afternoon, I believe." "Did Mr. Vance leave the house at all?" "No, sir. Not that I saw. He hadn't left Sycamore in over a week." "Then whoever removed the drawing came from within." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And knew when not to be seen." He returned to the blueprint, now focusing on the wall opposite the door, the one where the drawing had once hung. There, etched faintly, was a tiny circle marked axis, overlay point. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "do you recall the pinhole in the annex wall?" "Of course." "It aligns with this mark. Holmes reached for the drawing compass and laid it across the plan, carefully measuring the chamber's internal ellipse. His eyes lit with sudden focus. "There's a convergence," he said. "Not physical, but optical. From the center of the room, this point would receive the gaze. Whether consciously or not, it would become the mind's anchor. Like staring into the vanishing point of a tunnel," I murmured. "Exactly," Holmes said. "And if the missing drawing was placed here, its effect would be magnified tenfold. The curve of the wall would not merely present the image, it would ensnare it." Lestrade crossed his arms. "You think the drawing killed him?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned and looked out the window toward the annex, now cloaked in full twilight. "I think Elijah Vance built a room to trap a thought. And in doing so he created something more dangerous than he understood, a space not just of perception but suggestion, a place where the mind, seeking corners to rest in, finds none, and so it spins, endlessly." A silence settled over the room. Then Holmes rolled up the blueprint with care and handed it back to Lestrade. "Have it secured, no copies, and make sure no one else enters the annex." "Not even you?" Lestrade asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Especially not me. Not until I find the one person who could have walked into that room after Vance and walked back out." I stared at him. "You believe someone was in there?" Holmes turned toward the hall. "No, Watson. I believe someone still is." Chapter 7. The room grows stranger. The next morning brought a dull, overcast light that settled thickly over Sycamore House, dimming even the garden's ivy with a grey wash. Holmes had barely slept. He rose before dawn, refusing tea, and paced the length of the east corridor, eyes fixed not on the annex itself, but on the way the annex cast no clean shadow. Mid-morning, he stood once more before the iron door, fingertips pressed lightly to the seam. Lestrade arrived with the key, reluctantly. "You're sure this is wise?" the inspector muttered. "No," Holmes replied, "but it is necessary." I followed them both into the chamber, a creeping sensation crawling up my spine the moment the door sealed behind us. It wasn't the silence that disturbed me, it was the stillness of expectation. The room didn't feel vacant. It felt like it was waiting. Holmes moved slowly, methodically, his eyes scanning the blank walls with the intensity of a man searching a book not yet written. The faint smear on the floor beneath where Vance's body had been still lingered, but the corpse itself had been removed, leaving only a darker ring of absence in its place. He stopped near the pinhole we'd discovered earlier, crouching close. "Lestrade," he said, "did your men investigate what lay behind this aperture?" The inspector shook his head. They found it led to a shallow metal shaft embedded in the wall, about 4 inches long, sealed at the other end, no mechanism, no ventilation, just a dead pipe. Holmes gave a soft hum. "It isn't dead, it's deliberate. A viewing lens, perhaps, or something subtler." He took out a small mirror from his coat and angled it toward the hole, catching a sliver of the reflected curve. "There's nothing behind it?" he muttered. "And yet it sees everything." I stepped toward the center of the room, glancing upward. "Holmes, does it feel to you as though the ceiling is higher than it was?" He didn't look up. "It does." "But that's not possible." "No, it isn't. And yet." Holmes stood, this time stepping back to the precise location where Vance's body had fallen. He closed his eyes and slowly turned in place, as if aligning himself to something invisible. "I feel it now," he said softly. "The pull." "What pull?" He opened his eyes and met mine. "This room doesn't distort vision, Watson. It distorts reference. There is no fixed center, The more you try to establish one, the more it moves. It's like chasing the end of your own thought. He pointed to the far wall, the one that once held the spiral drawing. "Stand there." I obeyed, walking until I faced the smooth, blank surface. "Now close one eye and focus on the wall," he instructed. "Don't blink. Breathe evenly. Let your focus blur." I did as told. At first there was nothing, then a shimmer. Not quite a shape, not quite motion, but something like a slow ripple crawling across the curve. My chest tightened involuntarily. I stepped back with a start. "You saw it," Holmes said. "Didn't you?" I nodded, throat dry. "Yes, something, but there's nothing there." Holmes exhaled slowly. "This room creates the illusion of depth within flatness, and if the mind is encouraged, if a visual key like that drawing is placed here, it can push the brain into attempting to resolve the unresolvable. It loops itself." Lestrade shivered. "And you think that's what killed Vance?" "No," Holmes said coldly. "I think someone let it happen, or worse, helped it happen." At that he turned and knocked twice on the interior wall beside the pinhole, 2 sharp raps and a pause, then a third. We waited. Nothing. Holmes smiled, but it wasn't pleasant. "It's not just a viewing lens," he said. "It's a signal port, a cue. Someone knew exactly what sequence of stimuli would tip Vance over the edge. And now they've taken the drawing, erased the only anchor left, and vanished." Lestrade frowned. "You think they're still in the house?" "No," Holmes said. "They're in the blueprints, in the phrases, in every spiral Vance left behind." He stepped to the door. "We're not dealing with a murderer," he said. "We're dealing with someone who thinks they solved him." And with that, the door groaned open again, letting in light that felt, somehow, less honest than before. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. By late afternoon, Holmes had requisitioned 3 mirrors, a carpenter's chalk line, and a battered metronome from the attic of Sycamore House, all of which he arranged carefully within the annex, now cleared of all personnel save myself and Lestrade. The room, emptied of Vance's body and stripped of its only known image, had become something else entirely. A puzzle without clues, yet more insistent with each passing hour. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, as Holmes positioned the final mirror on the floor, angling it toward the aperture in the wall. "A reaction," he said, adjusting the mirror by a fraction of an inch. "Or more precisely, a recurrence. Something that indicates the mind's engagement with the room has a trigger, something external, deliberate, and reproducible." Lestrade, arms folded at the door, gave an uneasy grunt. "You still think someone used this room against Vance?" "I think," Holmes said calmly, "that Vance was not alone in his belief that the annex could alter cognition, and someone else wanted to prove it, or proved something through him." He retrieved the metronome, wound it, and placed it near the center of the floor. Its steady ticking soon filled the chamber, the sound unnaturally crisp against the seamless walls. "Now," Holmes said, "observe." He stepped into the dead center of the annex, the exact spot where Vance had last stood alive. With the mirrors angled just so, the aperture reflected itself in an infinite loop. 3 mirrors triangulated in a manner that made the pinhole appear to exist in all directions. Holmes closed his eyes. Tick, tick, tick. I watched as his brow furrowed, his breathing slowed. After perhaps 30 seconds, he raised one hand, not to signal us, but to shield his eyes. Though the room hadn't changed, I could see something was happening. He opened his eyes again and fixed them on the far wall. "Watson," he said slowly, "read me one of the phrases Margaret Vance gave us. The ones from the cards." I rifled through my notebook and read aloud. The spiral is not a shape. It is a surrender. Holmes blinked. Once, then twice. I feel it, he said. What? I asked. The suggestion, the invitation to disassemble. There's a rhythm to it, timed precisely. The spiral isn't just visual, it's linguistic. Each phrase is like a verbal glyph. Read in the right state of mind, with the right cadence. He stopped, eyes widening. It's not the drawing alone. It's the drawing paired with a sequence of thoughts. Someone engineered a ritual. Lestrade stepped forward. You mean like hypnosis? No, Holmes said sharply. Not suggestion through tone or charisma, but geometry, syntax, spatial timing. It's as if the annex was built to conduct instructions. The room, the drawing, the phrases, they weren't separate. They were chapters in a single text. I felt the hairs rise on my neck. And someone read it, I said. To the end. Holmes nodded, pale now. Exactly. He stepped away from the centre, flipping the metronome shut, and the ticking died. Was it Price? Lestrade asked. I don't believe so, Holmes replied. He's too reverent, too frightened, Price theorized, but someone else practiced, someone who understood that Vance didn't just want to expand the mind, he wanted to unfold it, like paper, flattened and turned outward. He walked to the mirror near the aperture and tapped its edge thoughtfully. There's only one person who moved freely between the annex and the rest of the house, he said. I frowned. You mean the butler? No, Holmes murmured. The house itself. I stared at him. The house? He turned toward me, eyes burning. Watson, what if the annex isn't the only place built to bend thought? What if Sycamore House was part of the mechanism all along, and Vance didn't build a prison, but a pathway? Before I could reply, a sound interrupted us. Footsteps, slow, precise, on the floorboards just beyond the annex door. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Ready, you men, he said. Why? Because someone has returned to finish the thought. Chapter 9. The Visitor Who Never Left the Door creaked open just as Lestrade stepped forward, revolver half drawn from his coat, but the figure who entered was no shadowy saboteur, no unseen hand behind the spiral's madness. It was Margaret Vance. She stood framed in the doorway of the annex, wrapped in a charcoal-grey cloak, hair tied back tightly, her eyes sharper than when we had first met her. There was no shock on her face, only resignation. Holmes lowered his hand slowly. You came back, he said. I had to, she replied. Lestrade blinked. We didn't hear a carriage. I never left, she said simply, stepping into the chamber. I stayed in my old room beyond the west wing. No one uses it. The staff assumed I was gone. Holmes studied her with unblinking calm. Then you've been watching. She nodded. Since the moment you arrived. Lestrade stepped forward. Miss Vance, this is a murder investigation. If you've been hiding... I haven't been hiding, she interrupted. I've been listening, waiting to see if anyone understood what happened here, if anyone wanted to understand. Holmes gestured subtly for Lestrade to lower his voice. You suspected someone would interpret the annex correctly. No, she said. I hoped no one would. But once you started reading the phrases aloud, I knew you'd seen it, or come close. She turned her gaze to the wall where the drawing had once hung. Her voice softened. My uncle wasn't mad. He wasn't building a room to escape the world. He was trying to re-enter it from a better direction. Holmes raised a brow. Meaning? She took a few steps inward toward the very centre of the room, the same space Vance had died. He believed, she said, that the human mind operates like bad architecture, right angles where there should be motion, boxes, walls, boundaries inherited from fear. He thought if he could create a space without those limits, physically and mentally, he could teach the brain to forget them. He said the spiral was the first natural idea. Everything after that was resistance. Holmes moved closer. You say this as if you believed him. I did, she said. Until the last phase. Until the night he told me the room had begun to answer him. Lestrade scoffed. Rooms don't talk, Miss Vance. She didn't look at him. No, but if you train your perception to expect something impossible, you'll start to see it. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. Where is the drawing? She met his gaze. I burned it. Lestrade stepped forward. You what? I destroyed it the same night he died, she said, her voice steady. It had to be removed from the sequence. It was the final glyph. The moment I saw what it did to him, how his body stood for 5 seconds after he collapsed, as if something had forgotten to let go, I knew I had to end it. Holmes's face was unreadable. Why didn't you come forward? Because I didn't kill him, she said. And because if I told you what I had done, you'd never believe it. You'd search this house for culprits while the real danger kept humming in the walls. Which is? I asked. She pointed around the annex. This place isn't a room, it's a mirror of how far someone's mind is willing to go to meet itself. My uncle wanted to reach the centre of thought, but he forgot one thing. Holmes tilted his head. Which was? She looked at him sadly. That there's no such thing. The centre keeps moving, you spiral inward, but there's never a flaw. Just understanding, then understanding of understanding, until the structure collapses. We stood in silence. Lestrade finally spoke. So what now? Holmes took a long breath. We close the annex permanently, seal it. No visitors, no study, no salvaging of Vance's work. It ends here. Margaret nodded. I agree. She stepped out of the chamber first, the hem of her cloak trailing behind her, like a page, turned with care. Holmes lingered a moment longer, casting one last glance to the far wall where the drawing had once lived. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. The mind folds where walls do not. And with that he turned, and we left the room with no corners behind us. Chapter 10. The Spiral That Remains. The annex was sealed that very evening. A mason from the village arrived under Lestrade's supervision and filled the iron door's outer frame with bricks and mortar until it disappeared into the eastern wall of Sycamore House like a wound cauterized by stone. Holmes stood apart from the rest of us during the process, arms crossed, his gaze fixed not on the work, but on the empty garden beyond, as if waiting for something to move in the trees or perhaps in himself. Margaret Vance observed in silence. She said nothing more about the drawing, nor the final night she had spent in the house before our arrival. It was as though her story had ended the moment she confessed. And yet Holmes watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with a deeper kind of curiosity, an interest reserved for puzzles no longer active, but not yet solved. We stayed one final night at Sycamore House before returning to Baker Street. I admit I slept little. The memory of the annex and the strange sensation it left behind, of space that refused to stay still, of words that circled back into themselves, lingered at the edge of thought like a tune half remembered. It was not until the train ride home that Holmes finally spoke again of the case. We sat alone in a private compartment, the whistle of wind outside the windows blending with the soft ticking of his pocket watch, which he held loosely in one hand. He had not opened his notebook since we left, nor lit a pipe. He seemed unsettled, or worse, thoughtful, in a way I had only seen after our darker cases, the ones that left a mark. "You're still thinking about the drawing," I said quietly. He gave a slight nod. "Not the drawing, Watson, the intent." You believe Margaret lied? No, he replied. I believe she told the truth, or her truth. But there was something she left unsaid, not hidden, merely avoided, a final detail too dangerous to offer, even under confession. I frowned. What detail? Holmes's fingers tapped the case of his watch once, twice. Then he spoke. She said she burned the drawing the night he died, that she witnessed its effect, recognized its danger, and destroyed it. And I believe that part. But she also said she remained in the west wing of the house after our arrival, that she watched, waited, yet no one saw her. No lights, no sound, no trace, which means she was hiding deliberately. No, he said, not hiding, testing. I turned to him. Testing what? He looked at me, eyes sharp. Us. A silence fell. He continued, voice low. Margaret Vance is not simply a niece grieving a brilliant but misguided uncle. She is a successor, not in inheritance, but in comprehension. She understood the room. Maybe not as fully as Vance did. Maybe not with the same fevered ambition, but enough to know what it could do. And she chose to end it, I said. Holmes nodded. Yes, but not before ensuring that no one else could pick up where he left off. The phrases, the room, the geometry, each piece designed to fold into itself, to defy linear understanding. But the greatest protection of all is disbelief. She needed us to seal it, to bury it, and for that we had to see just enough. He paused. I think she burned the original drawing, but I suspect she created another, one that contains only half the pattern, enough to remind but not activate. Why would she do that? Holmes looked down at the ticking watch. Because history erases what it cannot explain, and she feared Vance would be dismissed as mad. She wanted someone to remember the spiral, even if it remained unsolved. We said nothing for several minutes. Then I asked, Do you regret closing the case? Holmes gave a faint smile. No, not at all. The annex is sealed. The room will never open again, but I suspect the real annex, the one built in thought, remains open wherever someone dares to look at space and ask why it bends. He returned the watch to his pocket and leaned back. You see, Watson, he said, some puzzles are not meant to be solved, only understood well enough to be avoided. The rest of the journey passed in silence, save for the clatter of wheels and the fading countryside blurring past the glass. But even then, I sensed the spiral was not gone, only quieter. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes handed me a folded slip of paper, aged, creased, yet unmarked by time. I opened it. One phrase written in Margaret Vance's hand, a spiral remembers what the straight line forgets. Holmes didn't explain. He simply nodded once and turned away, back into the shadows of our study. The case was closed, but something still turned. Chapter 11, The Shape, Beneath the Floor. 10 days passed. We returned to the rhythm of our usual lives, if the lives of Holmes and myself could ever be called usual. Cases came and went, a missing banker's son in Marylebone, a fraudulent will contested in Dorset, and yet, through them all, Holmes remained, distracted. Not absent, no, but unsettled, as though something left unfinished scraped at the back of his mind like a dull blade. One afternoon, as rain streaked the windows of Baker Street and I read idly from the paper, Holmes set aside his violin mid-phrase and said, without preamble, "The floor of the annex sloped." I blinked. "I'm sorry." "The annex," he repeated. "The floor was not level." I set down the paper. "Holmes, the room was oval, curved, seamless, yes, but the floor appeared smooth, perfectly flush." Holmes stood, walking slowly toward the fire, speaking more to it than to me. And that was precisely the illusion, an imperceptible gradient, a trick of perspective, slight enough that the brain adjusted without question, But it means the center of the room wasn't the true center. It was a focal point placed by design, deliberately off-axis. I leaned forward. Well, why would that matter? Because everything about that room, Holmes said, was an act of placement. Every curve, every angle refused, every sound absorbed. But if the drawing was meant to align perfectly with a viewer at the center, and the center was false, I finished, then the viewer was being misled. Or guided, Holmes said. Guided to think they stood in control while standing exactly where someone wanted them. He crossed to the cabinet and withdrew the blueprint Lestrade had allowed him to keep, a copy made under Holmes's supervision before the originals were secured. He unrolled it across the table, eyes scanning quickly. Here, he muttered, pointing to a measurement just beneath the annex's structural cross-section. A 2-inch vertical variance from the door to the far wall, not listed as a slope, but as acoustic compensation. He looked up. Watson, I believe there is a chamber beneath the annex. I stared. A secret room? No, he said. Not a room in the physical sense, but a cavity, a void, perhaps no larger than a crate, but present, and accessible only through the illusion of alignment, the drawing, the position, the floor, everything pointed inward, downward. But the annex is sealed, I reminded him. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Yes, and it will remain so, but Sycamore House is not sealed. The foundation plans, the ones from the original estate, decades before Vance built the annex, those still exist. They may reveal what lies beneath. We travelled to Sussex the following morning. No ceremony this time, no constables or inspectors, only Holmes and I, cloaked in grey mist and early resolve, arriving at the county archive just past opening hour. The clerk, a thin man with a permanent squint, produced the requested drawings from a dust-choked cabinet. Holmes handled them with reverence, scanning each line until his finger landed at last on a forgotten annotation. Sub-cellar, unused, timber, sealed, 1854. He tapped the word. It lies beneath the eastern wing, he said. Predates the annex by nearly 50 years. The foundation was stable, but a partial sub-cellar was covered over. The records say nothing of it being filled in. Then Vance didn't build it, I said. Holmes shook his head, but he knew it was there. I'd wager he designed the annex to align with it, to rest just above it. We returned to Sycamore House by dusk. Margaret was gone, having left instructions with the staff not to disturb the sealed wing, but the housekeeper, unaware of the deeper history, permitted us entry to the old cellar beneath the kitchen. There, behind a sagging shelf of preserves and dust-heavy tools, Holmes found what he was searching for. A square of timber, slightly raised, nailed shut, not with care, but haste. He knelt, pressed his ear to it, and waited. After a moment he whispered, "Do you hear it?" I listened. Faintly, very faintly, there was a sound, not movement, not breath. Ticking. Holmes looked up, eyes wide and strange. "The metronome," he said, "still running." And beneath us the spiral turned again. Chapter 12. Below the spiral's centre, Holmes said nothing as he rose. His eyes remained on the floorboards, his body still, as if afraid that a single breath might disturb some delicate frequency echoing up from below. I remained crouched beside the old timber hatch, heart ticking in time with the sound beneath. The ticking was faint, yes, but it was real, rhythmic, regular. A metronome wound 10 days ago should have long since ceased, and yet it hadn't. Holmes drew a small folding knife from his coat pocket and slid the blade beneath the edge of the hatch. It took 3 careful motions before the first nails squealed loose. The sound was grotesquely loud in the stillness, and he paused as if waiting for the very house to object. It didn't. Another nail, then another. The plank lifted with a dry groan, revealing a narrow shaft beneath, no more than 4 feet deep and barely wide enough to crawl into. Dust choked the space, but Holmes's lamp soon illuminated more than rot and soil. There was no body, no bones, only one object, the metronome. It stood upright in the center of the space, ticking softly, as if untouched by time or air. And beside it, scrawled directly into the earth floor with what must have been a nail or sharpened stick, were symbols, curved, repeating, like an alphabet rearranged by someone who no longer needed words. Holmes did not descend. He stared down into the hollow, breathing slowly, lips slightly parted. "It's not mechanical," he said. "The metronome?" I asked. He nodded. "No key, no spring. The casing is smooth. It should not tick, but it does." I felt an involuntary chill begin in my spine. "Then what powers it?" Holmes was silent for several seconds. Then he spoke. "Belief." I turned toward him. "That's absurd." "Is it?" he said, softly now. "We've seen a room designed to twist perception, a drawing meant to loop cognition, a sequence of phrases engineered like musical notation, and now, this. A chamber that aligns not with architecture, but with intent." He turned to me. "Watson, what if this space isn't a burial? What if it's a witness?" "To what?" He stepped back from the hatch. "To the moment Vance crossed the threshold. Not into the annex, but into something far more dangerous. A space where logic surrendered." Holmes turned to the symbols carved in the dirt. "They're not random," he said. "Each one is a variation of a curve, none of them closed, no loops, just approximations of return." "Like a spiral," I whispered. He nodded. "Or a thought that cannot die." A gust of wind rattled the cellar door behind us, and I flinched. Holmes didn't move. "He never left this space," Holmes said. "Not completely. Whatever passed through him that night, whatever he saw, left an echo, and that echo needed a chamber to live in." I looked again into the hatch. "It's only a hole." "Yes," Holmes said. "And so was the annex. A hole given walls. And so is the mind when it follows a path with no end." We resealed the boards in silence. No ceremony, no photographs. Holmes took nothing from the space, not even a rubbing of the symbols. He said it would be disrespectful to copy something never meant to be read twice. Before we left the house, Holmes stopped in the hallway just outside the bricked-over annex. He placed one hand on the wall. Not searching, not measuring, just still. "Do you believe in ghosts, Watson?" he asked. I hesitated. "No, I believe in echoes and trauma and memory." He nodded. "Then we agree. But what if memory finds a shape? What if it wears a room?" I had no answer. As we stepped into the rain, I looked back once more at the house, its edges blurred in mist, its corners too sharp for comfort. And somewhere beneath it all, unheard by anyone else, the spiral ticked on. One beat, then another, and another still. Chapter 13. Holmes steps into the thought. We returned to Baker Street with mud on our boots and something heavier in our bones. Holmes did not speak during the ride. He sat in silence, fingers steepled against his lips, his gaze fixed not on the world outside the carriage window, but on something internal, something behind the veil of deduction, something that logic alone could not settle. That night, long after the lamps were dimmed and London turned inward, I found Holmes standing in the study, staring at the folded paper Margaret Vance had left behind. The final phrase written in her hand, "A spiral remembers what the straight line forgets." He read it again, then again. Finally, he turned to me. "Watson, I've come to a decision." I looked up from my chair. "And what is that?" "I must return alone." I stood. "Immediately." "Holmes, that's madness. The house is no longer under investigation. The annex is sealed. We've done what we set out to—" "No," he interrupted. We've concluded what the police required. We've resolved the surface of the case. But the core, what Vance truly intended, what he unlocked, is still spinning. I can feel it. I stepped toward him. And what do you believe you'll gain by going back? He held up the folded slip. Answers, or at the very least a confirmation, that what died in that room was not Vance, but something he summoned, something that wanted to be understood. Holmes, I started, but he raised a hand. I'll be cautious. You have my word. I will not enter the annex nor reopen the subcellar. I only need to stand in the corridor where the echoes are strongest, where the line of geometry first begins to blur. It was rare that Holmes made such declarations without inviting dialogue, but I could see it plainly in his face. He had already returned in thought. His body would simply follow. And so the next morning I watched from the station platform as Holmes boarded the train to Sussex alone. He carried no case, no weapon, no violin, only a single folded page and the smallest of his magnifying lenses tucked in the breast pocket of his coat. He returned 2 days later, but not as I had expected. The carriage that pulled up to Baker Street was driven not by Lestrade or one of Holmes's usual acquaintances, but by a stranger, a groundskeeper from East Sussex, who claimed to have found Holmes standing in the overgrown garden behind Sycamore House, unmoving, for hours, eyes fixed on the annex wall. Holmes stepped out slowly, hat in hand, coat wrinkled with damp. He looked at me not with fatigue, but with something worse. Detachment. "Watson," he said quietly, "I need to lie down." He slept for 16 hours. When he awoke, he asked for tea, a piece of chalk, and complete silence. And then, without a word of explanation, he began drawing spirals. He filled page after page in his notebook, some tight and symmetrical, others jagged, shifting unpredictably at certain turns. He drew with both hands, sometimes with eyes closed, sometimes muttering phrases I could not place. When he finally stopped, at nearly midnight, he placed the chalk down as if it had grown too hot to hold. I spoke then, carefully. "What did you see?" Holmes was slow to answer. "I did not enter the annex," he said. "Nor the subcellar. I stood only in the threshold between them, a point of resonance where geometry gives way to implication. And I believe Vance succeeded." I leaned forward. "Succeeded in what?" "In building the first structure designed entirely for thought," Holmes said. "A room not meant to contain a person, but to dismantle the parts of them that no longer served meaning. He called it a chamber of recursion. But that's too small a term. It was a mirror built for abstraction." I stared. "Holmes, you're not making sense." "No," he said softly. "I'm not, because sense is the first thing the room asks you to surrender." He opened his notebook and handed it to me. "These are not drawings," he said. "They're instructions. Keys. I didn't create them, I remembered them." "From the house?" He shook his head. "From before the house, from the space it aligned me with." My breath caught. "You mean a memory?" He looked me dead in the eye. "I mean a pattern older than language, older than thought itself." I sat back, the chill of that sentence settling in. Holmes continued, his voice steadier now. "I believe the annex, the drawing, the metronome, each one tuned to a mental rhythm that exists in all of us, but remains dormant. Vance did not invent that rhythm. He discovered it, like a note waiting to be struck. And when struck, it resonates." He paused. "I heard it, Watson, in my own head, not as sound, but as structure." I dared a whisper. "Did it harm you?" "No," he said, "but it would have if I'd stayed longer, if I had followed the spiral to its end." He stood slowly and moved to the hearth. "I've destroyed the notebook," he said. "What you read is all that remains. I won't allow it to be replicated." "And Margaret?" I asked. "What of her?" "She sealed her half," Holmes replied. "Now I've sealed mine." A long silence stretched between us. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "I did find one final phrase scratched into the garden stones, faint, almost washed away." He turned back to me. It said, "The spiral is patient." I did not sleep that night, and Holmes did not speak again of the room with no corners. But even now, when the house grows quiet and the world flattens into stillness, I sometimes hear it, not a sound, but a shape, a movement just outside the corner of thought. Waiting. Chapter 14, Holmes in the Spiral. It was the quietest week I had ever known in Baker Street. Holmes moved like a man between seasons, present, but only just. He responded to telegrams tersely, refused meals, and neglected even the chemical table, where so many previous obsessions had blossomed into solutions. His eyes bore no frenzy, no exhaustion, only a strange and unwavering calm that unnerved me more than any display of agitation might have. The manuscript we had hidden under the floorboards remained untouched. He never spoke of it again. But I noticed, with increasing unease, that Holmes had begun to sketch. Not in his usual chaotic scrawl of calculations and deductions, but with the quiet precision of someone copying from memory. At first I thought them mere patterns, parlour-level geometry drawn to distract the hand, but soon they became unmistakable, repetitions, variants of the same spiral, sometimes open-ended, sometimes segmented, always incomplete. Never once did he draw it closed. It was 3 days into this silence that I found him standing in front of the mirror, our largest, in the hallway between the sitting room and the rear staircase. He was not grooming, nor inspecting his collar. He was simply watching. I asked gently, "What are you looking for?" He didn't answer at first. Then, with a small nod toward his own reflection, he murmured, "The way the curve meets the frame." I had no reply. That night I moved the manuscript, not out of malice or distrust, but fear. I placed it in the physician's strongbox I kept for narcotics and sealed it with a separate lock. I did not tell Holmes. The following morning, Holmes vanished. No note, no coat missing from the hook, no sound of departure, only silence. I searched the nearby blocks, sent telegrams to our usual haunts. Lestrade had not seen him. The Diogenes Club had not received him. Even Mycroft replied with a rare, unambiguous line, "I have not seen him, and if he has gone where I think he has, do not follow." Those words chilled me. It was dusk when I returned home, rain in my coat and mud on my boots, only to find Holmes seated in his armchair once more, bone dry, still. There was something in his lap, not the manuscript, a page, one page. I recognized the sketch instantly. It had once been the third sheet in the folio. A curve intersecting itself 9 times before unwinding into a broken thread. "You took it," he said quietly. I did not deny it. "I was worried," I said. "You were changing." Holmes gave a faint smile. "We all change, Watson. The trick is noticing who draws the lines." He folded the page in half and placed it gently on the table. "I went to see Price." That startled me. "Price?" I repeated. "You found him?" "I did not need to find him," Holmes said. "He never left." "What do you mean?" Holmes looked up at me with eyes that did not tremble, but had lost something familiar, something I could not name until years later. "Price never escaped the spiral, Watson. He simply stepped outside the visible version of it. He lives in an asylum now, quiet, writing still, not in words, but in lines, curves. Every wall of his cell is marked, and yet no one calls it madness. They call it mathematics." I sat across from him. "What did he say to you?" Holmes exhaled slowly. He said the annex wasn't the final chamber, it was only a sketch, that Vance had begun construction on a second design, a place with no defined surface, not curved, not flat, just possibility. Price said Vance called it the unroom. I shook my head, but the annex was sealed. Yes, Holmes said, because Margaret made sure it was, but not before something was buried. He tapped the page once. Not physically, not with bricks or books, but within the minds of those who entered it. The spiral teaches the eye to disobey. The mind, that is its only lesson, and once learned, it doesn't fade. His hand hovered over the folded page, but did not touch it again. I felt it in the cellar, he said. I didn't say so then, but I did. A pressure behind the ears, not pain, not sound, just presence, as if the room knew it had been seen. You don't believe that, I said, but I wasn't certain I did either. I believe, Holmes said quietly, that some spaces are not built to house us. They are built to change us, and we misunderstand them when we look for walls. There was a long pause. Then I asked, "Is that why you've stopped solving things?" Holmes gave a thin, sad smile. I haven't stopped, Watson. I simply learned the cost of continuing. Outside, the street lamps flickered to life in the fog. Somewhere below, a cart rattled past on uneven stones. Baker Street moved on, unaware of the spiral still turning in our home. That night, Holmes did not sleep. Nor did I. He sat at the window until dawn, watching nothing in particular, as if waiting for a shape to arrive from the fog. And when the sun did rise, grey and cautious, he turned to me and said, "Promise me something, Watson. Anything. If I ever draw the spiral closed, burn it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We never spoke of the annex again, nor the unroom, nor the spiral that had no centre. But I know Holmes continued to think of it, because sometimes when he believed I was not watching, he would tap his fingers in even time, tick, 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 on the armrest of his chair. And always on the fourth beat, he would pause, as if listening, for the sound beneath the floor. Chapter 15, The Line That Repeats. Autumn had settled fully upon London by the time the next tremor reached us. Holmes was quieter than ever, but not idle. He resumed cases, though only those that demanded pattern recognition or cryptography. Human emotions, jealousy, revenge, betrayal, seemed to weary him now. He claimed no change in his preferences, but I observed how he avoided mirrors, declined invitations to rooms with curved walls, and turned away from spiral staircases as though they suggested more than assent. And he had taken to repeating a peculiar gesture, absent-mindedly tracing a loose arc in the air with his index finger, again and again until interrupted. I did not mention it. We had passed beyond the comfort of naming certain things. It was on a fog-heavy Thursday in late October that Lestrade arrived, unannounced and visibly agitated, carrying a thin file in one hand and a damp hat in the other. "There's been another one," he said, before even sitting down. Holmes looked up from his desk, blinking once. "Another what?" Lestrade laid the file flat. "Another sealed room, another death with no wound, another impossibility." Holmes's posture didn't change, but his voice did. It lowered. "Where?" "Cambridge," Lestrade said. "A mathematician, young fellow, Isaac Thurlow, 27, found dead in a locked study inside a university residence, door barred from within, no signs of trauma, just—" He hesitated. Just a strange look on his face, like he was halfway through understanding something, then stopped. Holmes's fingers stilled over the edge of his chair. "Did he leave anything behind?" "Only one note," Lestrade said, pulling it from the file. "Typed on a clean page, one line." He handed it to Holmes, who read aloud. The fifth line always returns to the second. The silence that followed was almost physical. I stepped forward. "Does that mean anything?" Holmes didn't respond. Lestrade tried again. Room was bare, just a desk, chair, chalkboard, but here's the thing. On the board, he'd drawn what the constables thought was some kind of clock. 12 radial arms, but none numbered. And between the 4th and 5th arms, nothing. Just a gap. Holmes finally looked up. "Did you copy the drawing?" Lestrade opened the file again and withdrew a photograph, grainy but clear. Holmes took it in both hands. He stared for a long time, then set it gently on the desk. "That's not a clock," he said. "It's a sequence." "A sequence of what?" I asked. "Of returning," Holmes replied. "Each line suggests a route, not a measure. It isn't time, it's recursion, a spatial riddle disguised as symmetry." He stood. "This man, Thurlow, he studied topology?" Lestrade nodded. "Abstract surfaces, spatial compression, theories about unwrapping curved space, not exactly bedtime reading." Holmes turned away toward the bookshelf. He ran his fingers along the spines as though reading with touch alone. "The 5th line always returns to the 2nd, he repeated. He was trying to solve the spiral backward. I moved beside him. "You think this connects to Vance? To the annex?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that someone is continuing the work, or perhaps never stopped." He tapped one book, removed it, opened to a marked page. "Watson, do you recall the metronome in the cellar?" "Of course." Holmes turned the book toward me. An illustration showed a chamber, a medieval mnemonic structure known as the ars memorativa, a memory palace built from repeating curves and false corridors to store thoughts in spatial form. "Thurlow's room was arranged the same way," Holmes said, the chalkboard facing the only window, a perfect oval desk, no books, no anchors. I saw it then, not just repetition, replication. "Someone is building the spiral again." Lestrade leaned forward. "Then who? Price is locked away, Margaret Vance has disappeared, and Sycamore House is sealed." Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he opened a drawer and withdrew the single page he'd kept from the manuscript. The 3rd sheet, the spiral with 9 intersections and a frayed end. He placed it beside the photo of the chalkboard. "They match," he said. "The angle of the arms, the void between the 4th and 5th. Thurlow was trying to map a pattern no longer visible. He was reconstructing a path." "A path to what?" Holmes looked up. "To wherever Vance went." We stood there, unmoving, while the fire burned low behind us. At last, Lestrade broke the silence. "Should I investigate?" "No," Holmes said firmly. "Burn the chalkboard, seal the room, tell them it was a heart failure." Lestrade opened his mouth, but Holmes raised a hand. "No one else must walk that line. No one. Not again." Lestrade nodded and left. That evening, Holmes packed a small case. No explanation, no appointment, only said he would be away for 2 nights. He gave me no address. When I asked, "Are you returning to Sycamore House?" he paused but did not answer. He left before dawn. I waited 2 days, then 3. On the 4th day, he returned, pale, eyes sunken, mud on his cuffs. He sat by the fire and said nothing for over an hour. Then just before sleep, he looked at me and said very softly, "There's a 7th version of the drawing." My blood ran cold. "Where?" He didn't look at me. "Not on paper," he said. "In the space between standing still and thinking forward, a version only visible when you stop asking for corners." I asked nothing more. He slept that night, but his hands twitched, and once, only once, I heard him murmur in his dreams, "The 5th line loops back," and then he was silent. Chapter 16. The Map Without a Surface. A brittle cold set in over London, and with it, A strange quiet settled over Baker Street, like something listening in the walls. Holmes spoke little during those days, not out of weariness nor illness, but restraint. I began to notice small changes again. He no longer walked to the park, no longer opened the windows, even on clear days. The curtains remained drawn. The mirror in the hallway, he covered it with a cloth. But what unsettled me most was the floor. He began measuring it. Not with tape, but with pacing, precise, repeated steps from chair to window, window to hearth, 23 steps forward, 23 steps back, then again, and again. His eyes fixed downward, as if waiting for the boards themselves to shift beneath him. I let it go for 2 days. On the third, I confronted him. "You believe it's here now," I said, "don't you? The pattern." Holmes did not deny it. "It was never about the annex alone," he said softly. "The spiral isn't anchored to a location. It's a framework, a script. Once learned, it doesn't need walls." I tried to temper the chill in my voice. "You think this flat is becoming like that room?" He turned toward me, and I was startled by the stillness of his expression. "I think," he said, "that I carried the pattern back in my thoughts, like soot, and now it's looking for edges to settle into." I said nothing for a long while. Finally, I asked, "What happened during those 2 days you vanished?" Holmes didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, he opened the drawer of the side table and retrieved a folded paper. Not one of the manuscript pages, a new sheet, fresh ink. He passed it to me. It was a drawing, not a spiral, at least not exactly. It began as one, curving inwards, folding back on itself. But then it broke, shattered into a scattered array of disconnected marks, like the path of something that had been circling and suddenly fled in every direction at once. Holmes said, "I drew it by accident. I woke with it on my desk. I don't remember making it, but I know what it is." I waited. "It's the escape route." I looked back at the page. "Escape from what?" he replied. "From recursion, from collapse." Then he added, "From Vance." That name had not passed either of our lips in weeks. Holmes stood and walked toward the hearth, his back to me. Vance believed that the spiral would unfold the self, not destroy it. But he misunderstood the cost. Thought is not infinite. It turns, yes, but only when there is resistance. A mind inside that room was like a wheel, given no friction. It spun until it dissolved. And Price? He spun too, just more slowly, but not for lack of trying. He wanted to map the collapse, chart it, observe it from just outside, but he never stood far enough. Holmes turned back to me now. "I did." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" I stepped far enough from the spiral's center to see its edge, and I realized it doesn't close, Watson. It repeats. The pattern only ends when you give it no surface to cling to. He stepped toward the table and tapped the drawing. This is refusal. It's not a map of comprehension. It's a break in the loop. I sat slowly, absorbing the words. "You believe you escaped it." He shook his head. "No, but I believe I chose not to complete it. That's all the difference there is." We were quiet for a long time. Then I asked, "And if someone else begins it again?" Holmes looked toward the window, his voice nearly inaudible. "They already have." He handed me another page, this one torn from a newspaper in Oxford. A student, missing. Last seen leaving the university library after hours. A single image was included, a chalkboard from the study room. No spiral this time, just words, written over and over in a loose arc. The second angle folds into the sixth. I closed the paper. "What does it mean?" Holmes exhaled. "It means the pattern's been translated again. New terminology, new minds, but the same curve beneath." He walked to the cabinet, where we had once hidden the manuscript. He opened the compartment, removed the strongbox, and set it on the table. "I think it's time we destroy it." I didn't argue. He opened the box. Inside were the pages, wrapped as before in muslin, undisturbed. Holmes lit the fire. One by one, he placed the pages into the flame, watching silently as each curled and blackened. When the last fragment turned to ash, he closed the grate. For the first time in weeks, he looked at ease. "I thought it would fight me," he said. "That I would feel it resist, but it didn't." "No?" He shook his head, "because the spiral doesn't care if you remember, only if you repeat." Later that evening, as we sat together in the lamplight, Holmes finally poured himself a brandy. "To endings?" I offered. He raised his glass. "To unfinished thoughts." We drank, and for the first time in months the flat felt still. No pacing, no ticking, no curves folded into the edge of vision, only silence. But before we retired, Holmes left one final note on the mantel. No explanation, just a line written in pencil. "Leave no surface smooth enough to echo." I did not ask what it meant, and I have not repeated it until now. Chapter 17. The House with No Walls. Winter arrived with a kind of sharpness that had nothing to do with the wind. The frost laid across London like a hush, on carriages, on rooftops, even in conversation. Baker Street grew dim earlier each day, and Holmes, for a time, returned to his more familiar rhythms. Rising at dawn, cross-referencing old cases, tending to the bees of thought that still hummed behind his eyes. He smiled more, drank his tea, shaved regularly, even took a case involving a stolen opera score that required only an afternoon's attention. But there were signs. He no longer entered the room unless it had at least 2 windows. He avoided carpets with repeating motifs. And when he walked, he changed direction every 17 steps. I pretended not to notice. Then, in mid-December, I received a letter. No return address, no formal salutation, just a message in tight, careful script. "You destroyed the drawings, but the shape has already moved on. Come if you wish to understand where it has gone." I showed it to Holmes. He read it without emotion, folded it once, slipped it into his coat. "Margaret," he said simply. "You're certain?" "She writes like a person building something, always has." "Then where has it gone?" Holmes didn't answer for a long time. Then almost absently he said, "Back to where it never left." That afternoon we boarded a train for Gloucestershire. Holmes said little on the journey. When I pressed him on where we were headed, he replied only, "Not to Sycamore House, to its echo." We arrived at dusk. The carriage let us out near the edge of a small hamlet called Salaridge, a village so modest it did not appear on most maps. Holmes led me down a narrow path off the main road, past frost-bitten hedgerows and an abandoned orchard. And there, nestled into the curve of a hill, stood a structure I did not expect. It was not a house, not exactly. It was a circle of stone, not walls but upright slabs, each placed with eerie precision, equal in width, tilted ever so slightly inward, like books bowing to one another on an invisible shelf. Between each stood narrow passageways, no doors, no windows, just open air and perfectly silent ground. And in the center, a flat space marked with nothing but a single low pedestal. Holmes said nothing as we stepped into the ring. "What is this?" I whispered. He looked up at the stones. "The spiral laid down." I turned slowly. "You believe Margaret built this?" "No," Holmes said. "I believe she found it, or rather, uncovered it. The spiral was not invented, Watson, only translated. Vance gave it corners. Margaret gave it back its original form." He moved toward the center, hands clasped behind his back. You see, the annex was a prototype, the cellar, a keyhole, but this is the unroom. The real one. The first one, Holmes said, and perhaps the last. He gestured for me to step onto the pedestal. I hesitated. "Humour me," he said. I did. Standing in the centre, I could see that each stone had markings, not carvings, but discolorations, lines etched by weather or time or touch. They weren't symbols, they were strokes, curves, repetitions. "You see it now," Holmes said behind me. "Each stone carries one arc. Together they describe the spiral. But unlike the annex, this version doesn't trap the mind, it externalizes it." I turned to him. "Then what is the danger?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "The danger, Watson, is that it does not lie. It shows you exactly what you are thinking, and then asks what comes after. Most people do not have an answer." From the far end of the ring, a figure emerged, Margaret Vance. She wore no coat despite the cold, only a long grey shawl wrapped loosely about her shoulders. She walked with the calm certainty of someone arriving at her own threshold. "Dr. Watson," she said. "Mr. Holmes." Holmes offered a small bow. "You've kept busy." She nodded. "I tried to bury it. I really did, but it's not a thing that stays buried. It grows in quiet minds." "And then you built this?" I asked. "No," she said. I restored it. It was already here, hidden beneath a collapsed barn. The villagers knew to avoid it. Said the wind made strange sounds between the stones. But it's older than the barn. Older than sycamore. It doesn't belong to any family. It's part of the earth. A place where thought echoes. Holmes stepped forward. "Why send for me?" "Because I had to be certain you chose not to finish it." Holmes raised a brow. "You mean the spiral?" "I mean the work," she said. "The cycle. The compulsion to build the next version. Price couldn't resist it. Vance couldn't see past it. But you stepped out of it?" Holmes looked at her. "And what now?" She smiled faintly. "Now we leave it alone. No more diagrams, no more mirrored rooms. This place doesn't need an audience. It needs silence." "Then why show us?" I asked. Her gaze met mine. "Because one day, someone else will begin again. And you'll need to remember what not to do." She turned back toward the entrance, ready to leave. But before she stepped between the stones, she added, "You know what the spiral teaches, don't you?" Neither of us answered. She looked at us both. That there is no center, and that chasing it is the first mistake. Then she was gone. Holmes and I remained in the ring as darkness deepened. The wind moved softly between the stone arcs, and for a moment I imagined I heard the ticking again, not mechanical, not rhythmic, but slow, organic. Like thought. Holmes placed a hand on one of the stones. "It doesn't end, Watson," he said. "It only waits for a surface." We walked back to the village without another word. We left the spiral behind us, and to this day, when I walk a path that curves without destination, or hear a line of reasoning that folds too neatly into itself, I pause, because some thoughts aren't meant to be completed, only recognized and left unspoken. Chapter 18. Holmes's final reflection. It was not often that Holmes recorded his private conclusions. The majority of our shared cases ended with an explanation made aloud, formal, public, demonstrative. He preferred clarity, not mystique, precision over poetry. And yet, 3 months after our journey to Salaridge, I discovered something unusual, a letter, unsent, unsealed, unfinished. I found it in the back of a leather-bound notebook Holmes had tucked into the upper shelf behind his chemical manuals, a place I knew he believed I would eventually search, but only after he was certain the matter was concluded. The letter bore no name. It was addressed simply, "To the one who finds the spiral again." I reproduce it here, with his original structure preserved. To the one who finds the spiral again, you will believe at first that you are alone. You are not. You will believe the pattern is yours. It isn't. You will believe that what you've found is new. That is the first deception. The spiral arrives not as a threat, but as a question. It flatters the mind. It offers recursion in place of reflection. It does not knock. It waits for the door to open inward. Elijah Vance opened that door. Margaret Vance closed it again. I stood between them, and I tell you now, do not step forward. Every room that folds inward carries the illusion of insight, but the moment you feel it looping, that hum in the base of the skull, that perfect line returning without seam, you must stop, for that is not understanding, that is surrender. You are not solving something, you are becoming something solved, and when the spiral finally makes you forget where it began, you will call that enlightenment. You will be wrong. This is the last line I will write on this matter, because the final act of resistance is to leave a thought unfinished. In Sage, I read it 3 times that night, and on the third, I understood it was not meant for me. It was meant for anyone who would come after him, anyone drawn to an impossibility that disguised itself as elegance. The case of Elijah Vance had no culprit in the traditional sense, no weapon, no motive of greed or passion. It was a crime committed by thought itself, encouraged by men who mistook recursion for revelation. And Holmes, as always, had followed it further than anyone else could or should. He had not solved the spiral. He had declined to finish it. That, I came to see, was the rarest deduction of all, when to not follow a pattern to its end. And yet he had left a final clue, not in the manuscript, not in the diagrams, but in his own changed behavior, those 17 steps, the paused rhythm, the instinct to draw and then stop. Holmes had written the spiral into his habits, then learned to interrupt it. That, too, was a kind of answer. In time, the details faded from public memory. The case was never officially recorded. Sycamore House remained sealed, and Salaridge's ring of stones returned to overgrowth. Price remained in his silent room. And Margaret, no one heard from her again. But I know this. The spiral still exists, not on paper, not in rooms, in thought, wherever a mind believes it has found a perfect return, wherever a question circles back into itself and refuses to stop. And so if you find yourself there, standing at the edge of some elegant pattern that demands to be followed, remember Holmes and do what he did in the end. Step aside, leave the centre unentered, and let the spiral go on without you. Dr. John H. Watson, 221B Baker Street, 1897.